quite an introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to that, to be honest. Thanks very much for having me, and it's nice to be able to thank you as well, because, look, that was a really kind words from Tracey, but the fact is it requires hospices to open their doors to us. We're not newspapers, we're not radio, we have to tell the story of the struggles that you guys went through during the pandemic, and struggle doesn't even come close, does it really, without being able to connect with the audience. And we can only make that connection, as good as Tracey's interviews are, and they are great, the connection really is with the people you deal with every day, and that's the patients. If we can't speak to patients, if we can't get access to hospices, then we can't tell those stories, we can't have that impact, and we can't make the government look again at issues that sometimes slip through the cracks. So thank you to every hospice that's ever opened its doors to us and let us speak to you. I won't speak for too long, and I'm kind of more interested in hearing what you have to ask me, really, but I, up until a few years ago, was pretty ignorant to what you guys did and do, and I think I'm pretty representative of a lot of the public, and I'll come on in a second to why I think that needs to be addressed, but it was a personal experience for me that led me to understand more about what you guys do. My mum had breast cancer for 5 years, and in the last few weeks of her life, she was not in a good place and was struggling with pain, and our local hospice intervened, and through them we got specialist care for her at home, which meant she could stay at home and die at home with my dad and me and my sister, not in pain. And I can never, ever repay the gratitude my family have to the hospice, St Giles, that did that. And from that moment, really, it was a kind of, as I was a pretty young journalist then in Manchester at Granada Reports, and it made me think about, okay, didn't know hospices did that. I honestly, let's be frank, thought you looked after dying old people. That's the extent of my knowledge, and I didn't really realise how much you do. And then looking into it, I didn't know how much you do with so little, and so much of it coming from marathons and cake sales and your charity shops. And anyone that doesn't know how much money you guys have to raise, whenever I tell them, without an exception, they are shocked that you have to raise millions of pounds a year, every year, just to keep going and to provide people with dignity. And that's what it is, it's dignity in death. It's something my mum had that she wouldn't have had if you guys didn't exist. But you only exist often through the gratitude of people. And I know how hard it is every year, because I've spoken to many of your marketing teams every year trying to raise that money, is a momentous task. And I genuinely don't know how some of you do it. And I know in some cases, some hospices really struggle to do it, and that's why you can get into trouble. I just wouldn't underestimate, I'll waffle on a lot, as I do, it's my job. But if one central message I will take, if you could take away from whatever I say today, just do not underestimate how little people know about what you do and how it's paid for. You cannot bang that drum enough, because people are ignorant. They do not know the amazing world-class care you provide. When people do know, it knocks their socks off, and it makes an enormous difference. But frankly, it shouldn't take a personal tragedy, and often you are dealing with them every day, for people to come to that knowledge. And so I think that's where we can step in and help. Now, I know inviting a camera, and often a reporter, and sometimes a producer into a hospice is difficult. I also know, and something I need to do more of in my job, the vast majority of your care is not performed in hospices. And so that's also a challenge for us to break away from that stereotype that it's always in a hospice, when the fact 90% of your care is not in hospices at home. But in terms of getting the message out there of what you do and the amazing work you do, I think the media can play a really, really important part. I know your marketing teams slave away day after day to raise the money, but a single day letting a camera crew in for half a day, a bit of work, and it will be 45, sorry if we spend half a day and then it's 45 seconds on the news, and you're thinking, they were here all day for that. 45 seconds. And I'm sure some of you are like, yeah, he came all day, and then you put 45 seconds on the news. And I also apologise for people that we interview and then don't put on. I've had that a few times as well, and I apologise. The cutting room floor is full of people that would have been famous. I apologise for that. But the fact is that 40 seconds and that half a day is being seen in ITV News, national news terms, to 3 or 4 million people. Now, I know there's a sort of rule about how you raise money in your local area, but I know you all try and raise it where you can. I also know that, back to the central message, getting the message out there of what you guys do, I don't think you're going to get any more of a chance to do that than speaking to the media. Now, I know that requires trust, and I know sometimes some of you may, and I apologise if any of my colleagues, definitely not at ITV News, but in the media have sometimes maybe not stuck to their word or let you in, it hasn't gone particularly well. I hope that hasn't been the case, but if it has been the case, most journalists who come to you, and we're talking here about end-of-life care, they're doing it because they care, they want to get the story out, they understand, and let them in. Definitely always let ITV in, then the BBC if you have to. But the fact is, letting the media in and getting those stories on TV make, I think, an enormous difference. Yes, I have no doubt that our reports put pressure on Matt Hancock and Helen Whately and others, and it meant, and often with any government, not just this one, they act when things look bad, or they act when, at the last second, something has to be done. But often, it's a bigger thing going on, and actually, it's the public awareness that you need to raise. The pressure has to come from the public, it has to come from them, and ultimately you do that, I think, by opening the doors up to the media. And right now I'm working on a separate investigation into social housing, and we've done that now for 7 or 8 months, and we're starting to see, we think, real change in that as well. So it's not just for hospices, but I think for you guys, the central message is getting people to understand what you do. And I really think we can be a force for change in that respect. So for every hospice that's ever let us in, I really appreciate it. If we call you and to ask to be let in, please let us in. And the one thing I will say on a practical point, I know sometimes it's difficult because you've got, it's difficult. The requests we make are difficult. We want to film with people. Ultimately, they are not very well and are, in some cases, dying. And I know that can be very, very difficult. But on the whole, honesty and patience is what's required on both ends. And so the requests we make are always, hopefully, from a good place. And we understand if things change, sometimes you turn up and it's not exactly what's promised. But if you can make that effort, that bit of extra effort to give us what we're asking for, and we put it on the news, I can assure you the positive on the whole will be the outcome will be positive, and I think the message will be spread across the country. I'll stop talking now, because I think that's about it. So, thank you very much for listening.
A really good one to start off with. What are the key elements of a good broadcastable story? So how would a hospice know if they had something to contact you about that you'd be interested in?
Yeah, is this on, by the way? I'm on the right one.
Yeah.
So there's kind of layers, which I almost like to go into, and I thought this might come up. So I work for national news. I've worked for regional news as well, but it's a spectrum really. So you guys will all know your local newspaper, and they'll be kind of your bread and butter. They'll be where you put your advertising for an event, where you're telling people there's an event on that you're running, where there'll be local people raising money for you, and that's great. And it's sort of the bar just gets higher as you go up. So for maybe local TV or local radio, it's unlikely they're going to be able to kind of highlight an event you're running, but if there is and often it is kind of we call case study led. So if you have an incredible family that are doing amazing work for a very good cause, it's the kind of thing that your local or regional newspaper or TV programme, BBC or ITV often, would be interested in. What we do is tell stories. So if the story's good and your sort of spidey senses are, this is a good story, and your marketing teams will know this is a good story. You've got press officers, they know, they get it. Often they've worked in that world. So if you think there's something there, that's kind of where I think you would contact your sort of regional press. And then for national press, again, the bar just gets a little bit higher, and often it's less about a specific hospice and more broadly about the sector. And that's sort of where we have conversations. And then, but to tell that story, we then need to go to a hospice. We need to speak to real people on the ground to tell that, to illustrate that story. And so again, I think we've had this conversation, you probably answer this better than me, you know of the hospices that are keen to highlight what they're doing and keen to get out there. So I think it's a kind of, hopefully answer the question, it's sort of a different approach, but definitely engaging with your local press is the first way to go about it. And look, if you reach out, if you've got nothing right now, reach out to your local ITV region or your local BBC region and say, hi, we're the press team at whatever hospice. We've maybe got some events coming up soon. Have you got an email address we can send? Just make sure you're on those mailing lists and you're getting stuff out there. Especially at weekend, you'd be surprised. They really struggle. I'm not trying to sort of lower the bar, but they struggle to fill stuff. And so, and actually, that's when weirdly, that's where people watch the news. So there's a snobbery in our sector about, oh, I'm working Saturday or I'm working Sunday. That's our biggest audiences. We get more people watching on the weekend than the week. No one wants to work at the weekend. So don't find yourself disheartened if they run it on a Saturday. More people are watching it.
I want to ask you a question about trust, because people sitting here might think, oh, you know, if we go and talk to a journalist, will they tell our story? Might they twist something? Might they find something we don't want to show them and put that on screen? I know when we first were having that conversation about how to approach number 10, about that first story, my press officer was horrified at how open I was being with you. But we also have very open conversations about when some of the government funding payments were late, the July payment that you all remember that took months and months and months, about whether we went live with that or not. But you were always in the picture. I always kept you in the loop and I could trust you with that. What would you say to people about trust with journalists? And what goes on the record and what doesn't? Yeah,
I mean, that's a whole session itself, trust in my industry. Some of you would have been burnt and some of you will have good relationships. I mean, I think some of it comes down to kind of just, you kind of get it. I think we've always had a decent relationship, and I think it's sort of the first time you do it, if you think, right, this is what we're offering, have they done it how we've wanted? Yes, great. Well, that's a little bit of a trust, and then you sort of build the trust over time. That's kind of an obvious point. I'm not going to lie, there is an element of kind of handing over control, and that can be difficult because you're sort of saying, come on in, you can control the parameters of what's filmed, who's filmed. And remember, especially with, I can't necessarily speak for other forms of my industry, but for TV in particular, remember, we're Ofcom regulated, so we're not going to break any rules that mean that if you complain about us, we'll be in trouble. So that's not the reason we would stick to the trust, because we should do it anyway. But we have to stick by certain rules. I have not, in my experience, in colleagues of mine, sort of been in a health setting where someone said, don't film that, and we've sort of filmed it anyway, and we would never do that in a million years. And so if you set the parameters early on, before we arrive, of like, right, this is what we're offering, this is where you can film, this is where you can't film, this is who will speak, this is who won't speak, you've then sort of got to hope we just do it. And I like to think in the vast majority of cases we honour that. And also it's not, based on our conversations, it's not in my interest as a journalist to break your trust, because I want to keep working with you. So there have been some times where you've said to me, look, you can't report this, but this is the situation. And I've gone, please, report it.
Yeah, please. Because
it's really good. I also know that it's counterproductive for you. And so I know in the future I still want to keep working with you. And that's like, I've got lots of contacts like that where, I work in politics, by the way, so it's not always this nice. So I have had things told to me where I'm like, yeah, nah, I'm going to have to report that. But that's different. It's a different world. But in the world where we're dealing with healthcare and different organisations, yeah, the trust I think you build over time. But there is an element of kind of handing over that control, I think.
How do we protect the families? So say we've got a really emotive story and we speak to the family, because hospices will often do case studies with families, it's part and parcel. And they say, yeah, you know, we're happy to go on the TV. How do you protect that family? How do you work with them? How can we protect them?
Yeah. I mean, there's sort of, I mentioned very briefly, I'm currently working on an investigation into social housing where we're going to people's homes in really, really poor housing conditions, and sometimes they're quite vulnerable, and we carry out safeguarding before and after. We have a duty of care. I personally have I'm aware of the burden of putting a family on television, whatever the context. And I've had reports where I've had families, especially in this housing series I've done, where we have had cases where they have received racist comments on Facebook or Twitter, and it's awful. We take those comments down and we ban that. And I'm not going to lie to you, the minute you go on camera, you're giving a part of yourself away, and we will do everything we can to protect that. In your situation, in your setting specifically, it just doesn't attract that kind of vitriol, or it really isn't. You're dealing with the most vulnerable people in society. You're dealing with families going through who have gone through an awful situation, and the vast, vast, vast majority of people are not going to receive that kind of response. As far as what we're concerned, again, it's about, for our point of view, it's about having the conversation beforehand, so understanding the story, explaining to them what we're looking to do, what we're looking to ask, being really honest and saying, look, we want to ask you about if it's the patient dying and what that is like for you and for them and their family. If it's their family, we're talking about the either a loved one who's dying or has died, and they're difficult conversations, but we do try and have that conversation beforehand. And I think it's really key that the hospice have that conversation beforehand and say, this is what it will involve. I'd like to think, though, that the reason why you've said yes to us in the first place is because you understand there's not just a benefit to you and the sector by speaking, but it can be a benefit to that family. It's their way of giving back. I've met so many families who are they're so grateful, as my family and I were, the gratitude for what you do. And if they think by going on the news and saying how amazing you are, that's their way of giving back. And I think they want to speak. Some families do want to speak, some don't, and that's fine. And never convince someone who doesn't want to go on. Not in this setting, we would never try and do that. But I think the duty of care from our end is definitely there. But a lot of this, I think you guys know. I mean, these are difficult conversations. They're your bread and butter, so you do them more than I do.
There's a lot of questions coming through about national versus local. So whether you do a story with Hospice UK or whether you do a story with a local hospice. And I think even nationally, we do both, don't we? We never, very rarely just do one with me unless it's me and the PM and we're trying to get money out of him. How do you balance that? Or how should we balance that?
Yeah, sort of what I was saying before a little bit about sort of being kind of realistic. So the kind of giveaways local, the kind of the more it's just about your hospice and something you're doing or have done, the more likely it is to be one for your locality or your region. That said, there are no rules here. I mean, I use this example. The first report we did into our social housing series was in Croydon, and it was about 3 residents in 3 flats in 1 block in Croydon. Everything about that story screams local news. It's not affecting anybody else. It's about these people in this 1 block in Croydon. And everything about that on paper says that's a local story. It was so horrific and so dangerous and so awful that we felt it required national attention. So there may be occasions, they are rare, but there may be occasions in your hospice where there is something going on or something has happened that is so, I don't know, moving or shocking or important that you think, you know what, I think more people need to know about this. I think that's I would say, about flagging with you guys and saying, look, we've got this situation, what do you think? And I work really closely with you in the press team about knowing, you'll say to me, look, I've got this, what do you think? So I think realistically, within your individual hospices, a lot of the work you will be doing will be local or regional news, which is still, by the way, an incredibly powerful way of getting your stories out. In fact, it's probably more powerful in lots of ways because it's focused. The viewers that you're speaking to are the viewers that use the services, and families use the services and will almost certainly donate to you. But yeah, within national stories, we always want to speak to a individual hospice as a kind of case study to kind of get a sense of what's going on. So it is that balance, and there's no real right or wrong answer, but I'd say that's sort of a rough. I hope that answered it. It's difficult to. It's a difficult. You can give me 100 cases and I could kind of go through them, and everyone would be different. But that's roughly, I'd say, how it works. But it's about being realistic. If you've got a charity event going on a week on Saturday, you're not going to be on news at 10. Like, not going to happen in a million years. And you'd be surprised how many MPs, by the way, send stuff being like, I'm opening a faith on Thursday. Will this be interesting at ITV National News? Absolutely not. Like, of course not. That's not going to knock Afghanistan off the news, is it? So just be realistic. But for most press officers in press teams kind of do get that and get the kind of level, I would say.
What happens if a family gets in touch with you or a journalist and says, we've had a terrible experience of hospice care? How would that play out? And when would the hospice get involved or know about it?
Yeah, I've never had that happen, actually, which I've never said it's due, but I'm sort of surprised by, because for a while I did lots and lots and lots of hospice stories, and suddenly you're sort of seen as someone who does a lot of a kind of story, and you get lots of people contact you. And so most time it's good, sometimes it's bad. Absolutely, and I genuinely mean that I've never, ever, ever had a single person contact me of any kind to say they've had a bad experience with the hospice, which I think says a lot about what you guys do. I really do. Look, I'm not naive, and no, neither are you. You'll have people that complain and have issues with your service, and that's the way of the world. In that scenario, like any good journalist, we would investigate it, and if they were making claims against the hospice, we would go to that hospice. We would come to you and say, these people are making this claim. And that's what we've been doing with social housing, exactly the same. People have been coming to us in their thousands with issues. Some of them have not been straightforward, some of them have been true, some of them have been false. In every scenario, and I go back to it, we're Ofcom regulated. We have to get both sides of the story. So it's a fairly straightforward process. If someone makes an allegation, we will go to the other side and get their story, and we would go from there. But I honestly, hand on heart, say we've never, ever had a single person contact us with anything negative to say about hospice, which is good for you to hear.
Somebody's asked the question, and you've talked a lot about social housing, so that's gone all the way from being a one-off, almost really regional news story, all the way to a documentary. And someone's asking the question, how do we get a hospice documentary? What are the steps? How do we get there?
Great question. How do we get a hospice documentary? Maybe we should have a chat about that. How do we get a hospice documentary? I mean,
put all your stories in Slido, by the way. Let's get this all agreed and signed up for this session.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, I've only done one documentary, and I've been a journalist for nearly 10 years. So it sort of shows if I do one every 10 years, I've got probably 2 more left in me. So maybe one of them is a hospice documentary. I think the sad fact is the vast majority of a kind of long-form documentary or investigations are often when things have gone wrong. So, I mean, if you want a documentary, start being really bad at your jobs, systemically, and we'll do the fees. But in terms of, I think specifically with the way I read it, and I'm just one person, but the way I read it in your sector, I think it's less about kind of a documentary on a channel. I think it's more about a kind of sustained central message of, we exist to do this, and we are funded this way. And those, again, I think, back to basics, a lot of people don't know about that. A lot of people don't know that a third, sometimes less, of your funding comes from the government. A lot of people don't know that. I'd say the vast majority of people don't know that. Most journalists I work with, when I did those reports, were finding out about it when it went on telly. Like journalists I work with, they don't know, and I think that's a sort of sustained, constant push for that. Of every time you do a media appearance, every time you speak to a journalist, it's kind of getting across that message of like, we need more money, we need more money, we need more money, and then from your point of view, it's that sustainable. We need a more sustainable funding model. Look, I'm not a campaigner. That's not my job. I'm not here to campaign for you. I'm here to shine a light on section of society, and I believe as a journalist it's your job to educate the audience and tell them something they didn't know, and I really don't think they know about what you guys do and the amazing work you do. So I think maybe part the documentary for now and let's focus on maybe that. I think probably that makes sense.
A lot of the time with media, it can be very short notice for hospices.
Yeah.
So, we're almost thinking about a situation where hospices come to the media and have a family or a story, but it's often the other way around. And you'll often contact me and say, I think there's an opening to talk about hospice funding. Can you get me a hospice? You talk us through how quickly that has to work for you. And is there anything that hospices can do to prepare so that next time you ring me up and say that, they can be one of the ones on the list that you might go to.
I mean, it's kind of how long is a piece of string. So sometimes we're doing, or I've done things with you where it's been like, I'm thinking about doing this, and I'm thinking it might be next week or the week after, and we have a bit of time, and that can be easier. But with the PPE stuff, that was like, we did the first piece, and my editors like loved that and said that we didn't know this. Let's keep going with that. And so then it became more like, can we do it tomorrow? I know that can be difficult. And again, there's no kind of like blueprint for how to respond to the press going, can we come tomorrow? What I would say, and I kind of go back to what I said before, I keep repeating myself on this, but it's kind of, I think, why I'm here, is that I would like do it, like really make the effort, like move heaven and earth. Like, I know I would say that because I benefit from that, but I genuinely feel I'm saying this as someone who like really, really loves what you do, because I really benefited from it personally. I honestly think that letting us in and letting us film and showing what you do is a really, really powerful way of getting that message across. So if it is last minute, and look, sometimes it won't work, sometimes it just can't happen, it's just not going to work. And I know, I sort of alluded to it earlier, but 99% of the time we'll want to speak to a patient. Like, that's the reality. If a hospice says we can't provide you with a patient, it's very unlikely we will want to film. And that's not because we're being awkward, that's just because we know that's how the audience relates. The audience gets that. That emotion, I mean, my job's pretty easy, to be honest, because every piece I've done on hospice is basically the same. It's a hospice, it's someone who's receiving treatment, and then after that, it's the CEO, it's Tracey, it's the problem. But that first bit is where you get the audience in. That first moment, seeing someone being cared for who is dying by you guys is the bit they will remember. No offence to your interview. Tracy's bit...
He's always cutting me anyway. He's interviewed me more times than
Tracy's bit is for the people making decisions to hear. They listen to that bit. The audience watches the bit with the patient. And so we might be demanding and we might push a bit, but we're doing it because we think that's the best way of telling the story, and I think that's the best way of getting that message across. So my advice would be, if we get the call, say yes, do your best, but also be honest. Don't say yes because you really want to do it, but you sort of back of your mind know, there's no patients here tomorrow we can do. Say that, because we'll do you next time. Like, we'll get to you. There's enough stories to go around. But I just think we will always be asking for a patient, and what I would say, I know it can change. I've had it change on the day. I know it can change. I know you've got 2 or 3 people, a press officer will earmark a couple of patients, and they wake up and it's a bad day. And I know that can happen, and we get that. We absolutely get that. And that's sort of what I said before about honesty. Just be honest. Call us before we arrive. Call us when on the way and say, look, it's slightly changed. And we'll make a call then. We'll make the call of like, is this worth us coming? Or should we come and see how we get on? But yeah, let us in, basically, is my advice.
How far are you allowed to travel? Is this realistically for hospices in the M25?
No, God no, absolutely not. I mean, I was on the train thinking, where have I been recently? So Ashgate Hospice in Chesterfield we went to. I was about went for like a whoop or something. Bolton Hospice, they're absolutely incredible there. And then we did Heart of Kent, we did Shooting Star Children's Hospice. I've been to Clare House in Liverpool. Brian House in Blackpool.
Yeah.
We've been all over. We're national news. I'd say it's the exact opposite. We're always told by our editors, get out of London, get out of London, get out of London, which actually in a way has ended up meaning that people in the M25 are hardly ever on telly anymore, because people in London are like, we want to hear from Northerners. Because people in London are from London. I'm not from London, but the people I work with in London are like, real people don't live in London. It's just sort of unfair, because a lot of real people live. I mean, it's ridiculous. But that's kind of how they see the world these days. So you're more likely to be on if you're not in the M25, I would say. There are times when, purely by just kind of, it's just happened. Like now, and I've got 2 hours, which sometimes happens. Yeah, we might pop down to one in Harrow or Brent, because it's very close. But on the whole, we don't tend to do stories about end-of-life care and hospice as sort of breaking news. That's sort of not, you don't fit into that world really, unless something's gone terribly wrong, obviously, which doesn't happen. So yeah, no, don't worry. If you're up in Newcastle, Scotland, wherever, no, like the further away the better. I would say.
Somebody's asked the question about when things go on the media, they can seem quite shiny. And we have to be careful because death and dying, and you know this from your personal experience, it's not shiny. How can we show that other side? How can we have balance? And that sort of links into, you were talking about, we need to get more stories at hospice at home, but actually every time we film, it's in a hospice building, isn't it? Because it's a short segment, you have to recognise it's a hospice, you show a building, you show staff, you show patient. How can we show some of those other bits of death and dying that we need to get the story out, but they're not shining? Yeah,
and that's partly, I think, our fault for being so kind of simplistic, but I sort of, again, go back to the thing I keep saying, which is kind of back to basics, sort of telling people, you're here, you're doing this. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I'd like to think that the stories, especially I did during the pandemic, I wouldn't say kind of glossed over the tragedy of it. I think the opposite, probably. I think we showed people, yes, receiving fantastic care, but also very upset and going through a really tough time, to say the least. So I'd like, and we spoke to staff who were really struggling with the PPE situation, and were really honest about how difficult that was, and you were really honest about how difficult that was for you guys. I think it is definitely a challenge, and I think other organisations have done actually maybe done that slightly better than we have. Partly, I mean, Newsnight did some really good stuff. Sky, I think, did some really good stuff with you about this, like kind of death at home. And part of the challenge for ITV is that we haven't got a rolling news channel. We've got sort of 3 bulletins a day, national news, sort of 6:30, 10 o'clock, and 1:30. But you knew that already. And so we've got a limited amount of time. We've got bigger audiences than those programmes, much bigger audiences than those programmes. But we've got less time to tell the story. So often we do have to kind of be in and out. And hence why I said earlier, please don't be upset if we only put 45 seconds on it when we were there for 4 hours, but that's sort of part of the deal. Trust me, my entire life is spent asking programme editors for more time. I've spent my entire life saying, can I have 30 more seconds, can I have 30 more seconds, can I have 30? That's all I do every day. So I'm not sure, I think we do highlight the kind of less glossy side, but I think there is a challenge to the care you do at home, because it is more reflective of the day-to-day of what you do.
So thinking now about controversial issues, so let's talk assisted dying, because it waxes and wanes in public consciousness and it's a big story. Would you say, or what would you say are the challenges and opportunities if a hospice might be contacted or might want to pitch in and talk about assisted dying? Would you recommend it? Would you recommend hospices get involved in something so controversial?
I'll leave that to you at that one, whether you should do it or not. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult topic. And every time, I mean, what I would say is that every time we ever do that story, it provokes an enormous response. It's a debate that I think it'd be odd if, given what you do, you weren't involved in it. I think it's a really, really tricky one. And without really knowing the angle as an organisation that you're taking, or as each individual hospice is taking, it's hard to sort of advise on what you do, and it's not really my place to advise you on what to do. But yeah, I think that's a tricky one. I think, but it's go on. Sorry.
It's so basically, as Hospice UK, we have no collective view.
Yeah.
Because there are 40,000 staff members in hospices, 125,000 volunteers, and then all the patients, and everybody has this big range of views. And from a hospice perspective, sometimes hospices take a position, sometimes they don't, because there's so many different views. And actually, I think what we want to do is get people talking about all aspects of death and dying. But it's also, this is almost our Brexit to a certain degree, isn't it? Because it can be very binary as well. So it's a difficult one for us, that we don't want to shy away from it, and we don't want to stop people talking about it. But equally, we know we could be, or individual hospices could be stepping on a minefield.
Yeah, I think, again, it's sort of, look, every form of media, regional, local, national, will touch upon this story in different ways. I would just say, if that's something you want to get involved in, there is appetite for that story. I mean, horrible word to use, but there is appetite for those stories. They are going to be with us. They've been with us since, as long as I've been a journalist, that story comes around every it feels like it comes out more often at the moment. So if that's something you want to get involved in, there's certainly, you won't struggle to get people who want to talk to you about it. And again, I go back to it, if you have patients, people you work with who are passionate about it, again, I go back to it, every news reporter will always want to speak to real people. And so if they're passionate about it and you want to talk about it, there'll be appetite if you want to put yourself out there. But yeah, minefield is the word you used, and I'd probably agree with that, I think.
Could we talk about children's hospices for a second? Because it's going to be very different when you think about talking to a family or talking to a child. What are the extra things that you need to think about, especially if it's quite a young child, very ill child, and the parents?
Yeah, I mean, I talked very briefly earlier about the kind of burden. I'm very much aware of the burden of going on television. I mean, that couldn't be more the case with children's hospices. I mean, again, one of the sort of facts that shocks people who don't know is that children's hospices usually receive less money from the government, and that's something, again, that most people just sort of sit and go, wow, and then sort of digest that fact is pretty shocking. Some of it can be like really, really low in terms of government funding. I mean, sort of the obvious stuff is we wouldn't do anything with any child in any given situation without permission from the parents. So that's always the case. That's an absolute fact, but it's always worth stating. We wouldn't do anything in terms of putting a child on television, especially a child who's dying or has life-limiting condition. And we would never do that without feeling like everyone was on board with that and everyone felt like it was the right thing to do. I'm trying to think, in the time that I've lots of filming in children's hospitals, I can't think of a time where I've spoken to the child, or we may have, but it's very rare. And there's a sort of real push often from our editors to speak to children because they're often cute and they'll say funny things. But with this area, it's very, very, you have to be incredibly careful. And you know you're speaking to families that their situation might change quite suddenly. And so I mean, all I can say is we're incredibly sensitive to that. And again, it comes down to what you said before about trust. I'd like to think that we've built up the trust as ITV News that you get that we wouldn't do anything ever to upset a family. But I think getting the message out about children's hospice funding is really, really, really important. Really, really important. And I've done a lot of work with children's hospices on that.
And a question that we did tackle as children's hospices, actually, was the sort of pros and cons on commenting on a topical issue. So with Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans, lots of hospices were contacted. Before the child went to a hospice, but actually when those children had gone to a hospice and were in the final days of life, there was a lot of interest in talking to children's hospices, but very particularly about that case. What would you advise? Is it a good idea, especially if you want to educate the public? Obviously, there are pitfalls as well.
Good questions, by the way. I hadn't thought about these questions.
I'm enjoying the fact I'm interviewing you because it's not going to happen again. It's always the other way around.
Again, not my place to advise. What I would say again is just kind of don't be naive. So if the story is about, if it's a national story and they're looking for an angle from you, and they let you in, and you let them in and they film and do lots of filming, but everything's skewed towards that story. I mean, don't be shocked. That's why they're there. So if the story's about Charlie Gard, etc., and then you let them in, you should know that's their angle. And they should be honest about that at the start. But if you want to, often it comes down to personal choice of a hospice. If that chief executive or whatever wants to add their voice to that debate, that's it. But be aware that you're adding a voice to a debate that you're sort of that's out of your control. So once you're in, then once they're in, and they're going to do what they have to do to tell their story, and their story isn't really about your hospice. It's about the other story. But that's a choice for individual hospices. I would say just kind of always be aware and be open, sort of have your eyes open to the every story we've ever done. We've sort of said from the start it's going to be about this.
Yeah.
So if they're coming in and saying we're doing a story about this, then don't be surprised if the story's about that when you watch it on the news, and it's not about the 2 hours they spent filming in one part of your hospice, I would say.
There's a couple of questions that have come through for Hospice UK, so I'll just answer those as well. So the first one, somebody asked if we can support a hospice if there's a negative news story out there. Yes, absolutely. So just ring us, tell us. We want to know about it anyway, just in case it becomes a national thing, and we can definitely support you. We do have also a network of communicators, hospice communicators. So if you want to make sure your team's on that, that's a sort of a peer support network as well. And there was another question about how do we know at Hospice UK where to point down at really short notice? How do we know which hospices might be willing to do this? And it tends to be because you're telling us. So if you're telling us you've got a story or your comms people are regularly in touch with things. But after this, if you are sitting here thinking we'd really like Dan to come in the next time there's a story about hospice funding or anything, then do let the comms team at Hospice UK know, and we'll make sure that you're on that list, because it's always good to have different people to go to. We'd like to send him around the country as much as possible.
Yeah.
There's a really personal question here, so you don't have to answer this. Do you think you and your mum would have let cameras in when your mum was dying?
It's a really great question. I don't know is the answer. I would probably say, as is probably the worst thing ITV would ever want me to say, no. But it's very rare. In fact, no, I've got an answer. We wouldn't film someone in the moments they're dying.
No.
So that's first of all, right. So I've only ever filmed with people who are often in hospices for maybe day therapy or symptom control, who we know are dying or have an end of life, a life-limiting condition, but we haven't filmed with, or at least we haven't identified someone with who's dying, who's literally dying, like in those hours, days. That we would never do that. So if you're asking me, would have let cameras into my home when my mum was dying? No. In the build-up, and mine's a slightly different situation because we only became aware of the hospice and received the hospice treatment literally in the last few days. And so I think if I go back and think if my mum had been receiving that help for a year, 6 months, 8 months in the build-up to it, given my dad has since done lots and lots of fundraising for the hospice and thinks they're absolutely incredible, and they are, I would say, yeah, as a family we would. I probably wouldn't, because I'm a journalist, I'm on TV, so I wouldn't. But if I'm not a journalist, I'm just a normal person, as in not like got a weird job that means that people would go, yes, I would, I think. But in the sort of build-up to it, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I think my family would want to show the gratitude of the hospice and get them. And my mum definitely would, by the way. I mean, she'd have 100% gone on TV. 1,000% would have gone on TV. So she would be like, if he was here, she'd be like, yeah, definitely 100%. So she would have loved it. So yeah, I think the answer is yes. But kind of dying, no, but we wouldn't do that with anyone.
No.
That makes sense. By normal person, by the way, I didn't mean like, do you know what I mean? The minute I said that, I didn't mean like, that sounds ridiculous, you know what I mean? Like, not as, like, whatever. Just keep digging. Where's that shovel?
Okay, I'm going to ask you a really easy question now, hopefully.
I'm only going to think about that. Whatever's been, that's all I'm going to think about all day now. I'm going to go, idiot.
I'm not going to out the person who just asked you that.
On the train, I'm just, say things like that.
A really practical question. We've got lots of people in the audience who their hospices aren't in England, so they're in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. How does that work with ITN?
Oh, God.
Oh, dear.
There's always someone from Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland like, what about us? It's different where we live. I'm only joking. That's like everything, but I'm joking. No, it's really, yeah, absolutely right. And I think we are really conscious when we do stories of kind of checking, okay, so there's the budget for this, England only, is it Wales, is this pot of money that you're being given.
But they can still go on ITN, even if you've got
100%.
STV
Oh, 100%. Yeah, sorry, to answer the fundamental question, 100%. ITV News is a UK-based channel, so we have Scotland correspondents. In fact, we have if anyone's interested, we've got a current job open for a new Scotland reporter and a new Scotland producer, and we've got a job open for a Wales correspondent and a Wales producer. So we are hiring in those areas. But yeah, no, absolutely, we cover the whole. I mean, yes, we cover the whole UK. So if there's a story in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, absolutely, 100%. In fact, definitely get in touch, because we need to do more. We need to do more in those areas. But when we ever do a hospice story, any story on health, you always have to kind of check, okay, who's that? And you'll always have someone tweet being like, I think you'll find that that's a devolved issue. It's like a minefield. But yeah, no, 100%.
Brilliant. Well, I could carry on talking to you for the next couple of hours. I'm sure everyone could carry on listening, but I've got this screen flashing up in front of me that keeps saying, please wrap up now. So I think they want to...
It does literally say that.
It does actually say that.
Please begin to wrap up now.
It's been saying that for 10 minutes. So I need to let you all go downstairs to the exhibition hall for your lunch to pick up your posters and your last opportunity to speak to our exhibitors, so please do that. But also, if you want to pop up on the stage and say hello to Dan as well, then please do feel free to do that before you go downstairs. Thank you very much.